Walking by faith in business and in life is hard. It's not a matter of if you will get tired. It is a matter of when you will get tired. Fortunately, Scripture gives us really clear instruction for how to reflect when we feel weary. Hebrews chapter 12, verse 3 says, "Consider him who endured from sinners such hostility against himself, so that you may not grow weary or faint-hearted." We're to consider Jesus and the suffering that he went through on our behalf, so that in our own struggles and in our own weariness, we can endure and we can persevere. Welcome to week 8. This is a reflection on the suffering of Christ. We are instructed to consider him, not merely to acknowledge his sacrifice in passing, nor to reduce the cross to an ornament worn lightly around our necks. The writer of Hebrews calls us to a deliberate, unflinching meditation, to fix our eyes on the full weight of what Christ endured, so that we may not grow weary and lose heart. To consider him is to enter, however briefly, into the gravity of what took place on that hill outside of Jerusalem 2,000 years ago. What follows is an attempt to do just that, to examine with some historical care and some reverent attention the physical, emotional, and spiritual dimensions of Christ's suffering on the cross. Not for the sake of morbid curiosity, but because the depth of his agony reveals the depth of his love for us. We cannot rightly grasp what he gave us until we reckon honestly with what it cost him. The Roman orator Cicero, writing a century before Christ, declared crucifixion to be the most cruel and disgusting punishment, and insisted that the very mention of the cross should be far removed not only from a Roman citizen's body, but from his mind, his eyes, and his ears. Crucifixion was designed not merely to kill someone, but to erase every vestige of human dignity from the condemned. It was reserved almost exclusively for the lowest strata of Roman society: slaves, foreigners, revolutionaries, and the vilest criminals. A Roman citizen, no matter the severity of his crime, was virtually never subjected to it. And the Jewish historian Josephus, who witnessed mass crucifixions during the siege of Jerusalem in 70 AD, called it the most pitiable of deaths. Crucifixions were deliberately public spectacles. The Romans chose elevated ground along busy roads to ensure maximum visibility. The condemned were stripped entirely naked and displayed for everyone to see, exposed not only to the elements, but to the jeering, spitting, and ridicule of passerbys. After the slave revolt of Spartacus in 71 BC, the Roman general Crassus ordered 6,000 captured slaves to be crucified along the Appian Way. Their bodies lined the road for 130 miles from Rome to Capua. The corpses were left to rot on their crosses, picked apart by birds and wild animals, and served as a grotesque warning for anyone who might challenge Rome's authority. That is the context, the cultural horror into which the Son of God willingly walked. And for the Jews, crucifixion carried an even deeper offense. Deuteronomy 21:23 declares that anyone hung on a tree is under the curse of God. To die by crucifixion was not merely to suffer, it was to be publicly marked as one whom God himself had cursed. The Apostle Paul understood this with devastating clarity when he wrote in Galatians 3:13 that Christ redeemed us from the curse of the law by becoming a curse for us. The cross was an offense to Roman sensibility, and it was an abomination to Jewish theology. And yet, it was the instrument that God chose. But before the cross came the beating. Roman law mandated that those sentenced to crucifixion first had to be subject to flagellation, a punishment so severe that it alone was sometimes fatal. The instrument used was called a flagrum, a short-handled whip fitted with 2 or 3 leather thongs. Woven into those thongs were small lead balls and sharp fragments of bone and iron hooks that were meant to tear into the skin with each successive blow. The victim was stripped naked, bound to a low post or column, and beaten by trained soldiers called lictors, usually 2 or one of them on each side, delivering alternating blows across the shoulders, backs, buttocks, and legs. The flagrum was designed so that with each strike, the leather thongs would wrap around the body, and the lead weights would drive deep into the tissue while the bone fragments and iron would catch at the skin and tear it on the return. Eusebius, the early church historian, recorded eyewitness accounts of Roman scourging in which victims were lashed until their veins and arteries were laid bare, and in some cases, the inner structures of the body, the muscles, sinew, even the bowels were exposed to view. The soldiers were restrained only by the practical need to keep the prisoner alive long enough to endure the crucifixion that would follow. The beating continued at the discretion of a commanding centurion who would judge how much the condemned could survive. This beating left Jesus so weakened that he could not carry his own crossbeam to the place of execution. Simon of Cyrene was conscripted from the crowd to help bear it for him. After the beating, the soldiers pressed a crown woven from thorns into his scalp, producing profuse bleeding and waves of excruciating pain that would have radiated across his face and neck. They draped a purple robe over his shredded back, a mockery of royalty, which would have partially stuck to the wounds on his skin, and they would have torn open again as they ripped the cloak off. They struck him across the face. They spat on him. They knelt before him in mockery, saying, "Hail, King of the Jews." The Romans did not invent crucifixion, but they did perfect it. What the Persians and the Carthaginians had practiced as a blunt instrument of terror, Rome refined over 5 centuries into a method of execution engineered to extract the maximum possible suffering over the longest possible duration. Every single element was deliberate. Every detail served the purpose of prolonging agony while ensuring that the victim remained conscious and publicly visible. At Golgotha, Jesus was thrown to the ground onto his lacerated back and stretched across the horizontal crossbeam called the patibulum. Iron spikes, 5 to 7 inches in length, were then driven through each wrist, not through the palms. The placement was precisely informed by grim anatomical knowledge. The nail was driven to the space between the carpal bones near the wrist at a location that would compress the median nerve, one of the major nerves in the hand, producing bolts of searing pain while causing the fingers to curl into claw-like contraction. Crucially, this placement avoided all the major arteries in the wrist, preventing any rapid blood loss that would hasten death. The jarring impact of the crossbeam slamming into place would have wrenched the arms out of their sockets and sent a shockwave of pain through every wound in his body. The feet were then positioned against the stipes, one overlapping the other, and a single spike was driven through both. Again, placed intentionally to avoid major blood vessels while ensuring that Jesus could use his legs to push upward, which was a grim necessity for the mechanics of dying that would follow. A small wooden title was then nailed above his head that read in Hebrew, Latin, and Greek, "Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews," a declaration that Pilate refused to alter even when the chief priests objected. Once suspended, Jesus entered a cycle of torment that the Romans had calibrated with a terrible expertise. The weight of the body pulling downward on the outstretched arms gradually compressed the lungs and restricted the muscles of respiration. In order to draw a breath, Jesus would have had to push up against the nail in his feet, dragging his shredded back along the rough wood of the stipes, straightening his legs just enough to relieve the pressure on his chest and take in air. Each breath required an agonizing effort, and each exhalation meant sagging back down into the suffocating posture. This cycle, push up, breathe, collapse, push up, breathe, collapse, would continue for hours. When the Romans wished to hasten death, they would break the legs below the knee. Without the ability to push upwards against the nail, suffocation would follow within minutes. The soldiers broke the legs of the two men crucified alongside Jesus, but found when they reached him that he was already dead. And so they left his legs intact, an unwitting fulfillment of the prophetic requirement for the Passover lamb that not a single bone should be broken. To confirm his death, a soldier thrust a spear into his side, and what flowed out was blood and water. And yet, for all the unfathomable physical torment, the deepest suffering of Christ was not of the body, it was of the soul. From before the foundations of the world, the Son had existed in perfect, unbroken communion with the Father. The Gospel of John opens with this reality as the bedrock of all things. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. The preposition within that passage carries a connotation of intimate, face-to-face relationship, a communion so complete, so continuous, so foundational that it had no beginning and knew no interruption. For all of eternity past, the Father and the Son had dwelt in the fullness of shared glory, mutual delight, and perfect love. Jesus himself prayed in John 17:5, "And now, Father, glorify me in your own presence with the glory that I had with you before the world existed." On the cross, that communion was severed. As the sin of every human being who ever lived and whoever would live was laid upon Jesus' shoulders, the accumulated weight of every rebellion, every cruelty, every act of hatred and betrayal and wickedness across all of human history, the Holy Father turned his face away from the Son. Not because the Father ceased to love him, but because the holiness of God cannot look upon sin with approval. And in that moment, the sinless Christ had become sin itself on our behalf. Paul writes in 2 Corinthians 5:21, "For our sake, he made him to be sin who knew no sin, so that in him we might become the righteousness of God." And from the cross came the cry that shook the cosmos. "Eli, Eli, lema sabachthani?" My God, why have you forsaken me?" Consider what those words cost him. This was not just a rhetorical quotation of Psalm 22. This was the anguished, bewildered cry of the Son experiencing for the first and only time in all of eternity the absence of his Father's presence. He had never known a moment apart from the Father's love and was now engulfed in the darkness of total separation from God. He who was the light of the world was swallowed by a darkness so absolute that even the sun refused to shine. And the land was covered in blackness from the 6th hour to the 9th. We can't fathom this. We who have never known perfect communion with God, we cannot comprehend what it would mean to lose it. We who have lived our entire lives in varying degrees of distance from the Father, we cannot begin to grasp the shattering devastation of that first rupture. The ripping apart of a union that had been the very foundation of reality. If the physical pain on the cross was excruciating, the spiritual agony of forsakenness was infinite, because it was borne by one whose capacity for relationship with the Father itself was infinite. It was this separation, this bearing of our sin, this absorbing of the full wrath of God against all of the evil of all of the ages, that was the true sacrifice. The nails held his body to the wood, but it was his love that held him on the cross for us. The writer of Hebrews does not tell us to consider the cross as an abstract theological concept. He tells us to consider him, the person who endured it, to fix our attention not on a doctrine, but on a man who, although he was God, chose to enter into the fullness of human suffering so that we might enter into the fullness of divine life. He endured the mockery of soldiers who did not know what they did. He endured the abandonment of friends who had sworn that they would never leave him. He endured the beating, the thorns, the nails, the spear. He endured the jeering crowds, the shame of nakedness, the curse of the tree. He endured the one thing that no creature in heaven or on earth has ever endured or ever will, the forsaking of the Father's presence under the weight of the world's sin. He did all of this willingly, and he did it all for us. What's crazy about this is that Jesus knew all of this was coming. He prayed in anguish in the garden on the night that he was arrested. He even asked the Father to remove this burden from him. But he walked into it willingly for the hope set before him, the knowledge that on the other side of his obedience to the Father's call for his life, that he would be glorified and that we would be saved. And when we are tired, when we are weary, when we are suffering, we need to remember that Jesus walked forward in the full knowledge of the suffering that was ahead of him, for the hope that was set before him on the other side of fulfilling his purpose on earth. Every single one of you has a purpose that you are being called towards. Consider him and the suffering that he went through, and consider the hope that's set before you as well as you pursue your calling in obedience to the Father.